War is hell. It reaches every hand, from the soldier in the trench to the nurse at his side, from the engineer forging weapons to the families left behind. These are their stories. This is World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches. Today's episode, I photographed that. The room was stifling hot. There were no windows, no open door to allow a draft. The faint buzzing of the electric light overhead was the only sound beside the thoughts churning through his head. Sergeant Ernst Falk had never been in a situation like this before. He had never been taken into military custody and left to wonder what would become of him. The door opened behind him. He heard someone enter, but did not look to see who it was. He could hear the dress shoes click against the floor. An officer, he thought to himself. Soon, the man was standing before him, blocking his view of the maps that adorned the far wall. The man had a packet of papers, and he sat them down on the table. He pulled a chair out and sat down. Another man walked in, placed a decorative glass pitcher of water on the table along with two dented metal cups, and walked out, closing the door behind him. Ernst watched as the officer across from him took a cup and slowly filled it with water. He sat it in front of Ernst and then slowly proceeded to fill the other one. The officer took a drink and then sighed heavily before he began to speak. "Your name is Sergeant Ernst Falk, is that correct?" Ernst's frayed nerves kept him silent. He waited for the man to look up from the papers before giving a small nod in the affirmative. "Sergeant Falk, do you know why you're here with me today?" the man asked. Still fighting his nerves, he forced himself to speak. "Yes, sir, I do." "I'm sorry, where are my manners? I am Colonel Kruger. Please, you may address me as such." "Yes, Colonel Kruger, I do know why I am here." The colonel sat back in his chair and smiled. "Very good. This interview should be short. Tell me why you did it, please." The skies just outside of Leipzig were cloudless as he looked down upon the rolling hills where the new railroad line would be laid. Removing one hand from the control stick, he positioned his camera and snapped a picture. Then he wound the film forward and took another. In the past, he would create a quick sketch with one hand while controlling his aircraft with the other. The camera made this process much easier and safer. 2 years ago, he would have done his surveying work from the ground using a compass, measuring chain, and sketchbook. The work was slow and often exhausting. Every hill had to be climbed, every stream crossed, and every measurement carefully recorded by hand. Whenever possible, Ernst had used the terrain to his advantage, walking up hills and traversing mountains to get a bird's-eye view of the valleys and rivers below. Flying had changed all of that. What once took weeks could now be accomplished in a matter of hours. Rivers revealed their winding paths. Roads appeared where forests had once concealed them. Entire valleys unfolded beneath him like maps already drawn. He had become obsessed with the idea of learning how to fly. So he had. After an hour in the sky and about 20 photographs of the site, he made his way back to the airfield where he performed a textbook landing. Climbing out of the aircraft, he handed the camera to Heinrich Müller, a 20-something photographer who would develop the images. Later, the two would work together to create a detailed map of the 10 square miles he had just surveyed. Heinrich was young, idealistic, and very enthusiastic. "I cannot wait till I get to do that," an excited Heinrich exclaimed, and then added, "I hear girls love pilots." Ernst giggled at that. "Maybe they do, but give it a year or so of lessons and you may find yourself flying too." "A year?" Heinrich laughed. "I thought you would say a month." "I wasn't learning to impress anyone." "Then why learn? What's the point?" Heinrich asked. Ernst could not tell if he was being sarcastic. Ernst looked back towards the aircraft sitting on the field. "Because every time I went up, I could see something I couldn't see from the ground." Excitedly, Heinrich blurted, "I want to fly because it seems like an adventure. Did the people really look like ants from up there, like the other pilots say? Ernst smirked and shook his head. I guess so, but I don't see many people when I'm up there. I'm usually above empty land. Still, flying sounds fun. Maybe I like danger. I don't know. Soon, he found himself inside the small wooden building that served as the airfield office. As he removed his flight clothes, he folded them and put them in a nearby bag. Then he unfolded his regular clothes, which he had waiting for him, and got dressed. His parents' home was 5 miles away in Leipzig. He would walk home as he usually did. However, on his way out, something caught his eye. It was a flyer. He stopped to read it. The Imperial German Army Air Service observers, photographers, and pilots needed. The rapid movement of modern armies requires accurate maps and timely observation. Men experienced in surveying, cartography, photography, aviation are encouraged to apply for service in the Imperial German Army Air Service. Applicants with experience in aerial photography and mapmaking are especially desired. Serve the Empire from above. Apply at your nearest military office. He had gone to the military office the very next day and applied. Kruger looked at him from across the table. And they accepted you? They did, sir, Ernst answered. Kruger leaned back in his chair. And what made you decide to apply? Ernst took a moment before he answered. We are at war, sir. If I can help the Empire by making maps and marking enemy troop movements, then I felt that I should. Why not just join the infantry? We still need men at the front, Kruger asked. Because I can fly, sir. Kruger nodded and made a note. Honest answer. Please, continue. He had never seen an aircraft quite like it before. The machine sat at the edge of the field, surrounded by mechanics and what looked like officers. Its fabric-covered wings stretched wide beneath the morning sun. He approached it, and then Ernst slowly walked around it, running his hand along the wooden fuselage. The canvas felt taut beneath his fingers. Every wire, every brace, every fitting had a purpose. It looked less like a machine and more like something caught halfway between an invention and a living creature. Compared to the civilian aircraft he was accustomed to flying, this one appeared sturdier, more practical, built not for sightseeing or surveying, but for military service. For several moments, he simply stood there studying it, trying to imagine what the world might look like from its cockpit. The briefing he had received from the commanding officer had frightened him. Not enough to regret his decision, but enough to make him cautious. Stay above 4,000 feet, the officer had told him and the other pilots. At that altitude, enemy riflemen would struggle to hit them. When he first applied, Ernst had not considered that someone might shoot at him. He had imagined maps. He had imagined photographs. He had imagined observing the war from above. The possibility of becoming part of it had never crossed his mind. But he would stay at a safe altitude and do his job just the same. On this day, he was flying with 4 other pilots. Their assignment was simple enough. Observe enemy positions, photograph any notable changes, and estimate troop concentrations whenever possible. The information they gathered would be compared against reports from previous days. New trenches, fresh artillery batteries, additional supply wagons, or unusually large troop movements could reveal an enemy's intention long before an attack began. It was not glamorous work, but it was important work. The men planning the war relied upon information gathered by men like Ernst. The wooden airframe of the plane rattled as he took flight and headed north. He kept an eye on the lead plane, a pilot he did not know, and ascended as he did. Once the 4,000 feet altitude was reached, the lead plane shifted its trajectory towards the west. Ernst could only assume they were now headed towards the front lines. 15 minutes later, he could see plumes of smoke rising on the horizon, each one separate and far apart from each other. The sound of shellfire began to reach his hearing. 3 more minutes had passed when the scarred landscape began to take shape. Zigzagging trench lines stretched across the countryside. Shell craters covered entire fields. Tiny figures moved through the trenches below. He had spent years surveying construction projects and railway expansions, watching men reshape the land for progress. What he saw below now was something entirely different. The landscape had been altered just the same, but there was nothing being built here. He shifted his head to look over the side of his aircraft as they flew over the German lines. Men were beginning to stream out and run across the tattered land below. Gunfire erupted from the other side. He could see the running figures below, little more than moving dots from his vantage point. Then several stopped altogether. Had they been shot? He assumed they had. 30 seconds later, the lead plane had shifted direction again, this time headed toward and ultimately following the enemy trench system. Ernst took his camera and began to take photos. 20 minutes later, the lead plane had turned south and they had headed home. Kruger looked up from his notepad. "So, you were directly above the enemy lines, is that correct?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Ernst replied, and then continued. "We did the jobs we had applied for. We took pictures, sketched positions, and in the end we all got together and drew the maps of what we saw. We did what had been required of us." Kruger then added, "In all of your reconnaissance missions, were you ever shot at by the enemy?" "Of course," Ernest said. "The enemy wants us taken down so we cannot report their positions accurately. That's why we flew so high." Kruger sat back in his chair, putting his pen in his mouth as he spoke next. "That is what makes your recent decisions so puzzling to me, Falk." It was another morning, another flight, another mission. It had been nearly 2 months since Ernst had joined the Air Service, and at that time he had crossed above the enemy lines more than 60 times, photographing trenches, artillery positions, supply routes, and troop movements. On particularly busy days, he flew 3 missions before the sun set. The fear he had felt during his first flight had long since faded. The war below was still dangerous, but it had become familiar. He knew the routes. He knew the landmarks. He knew where the enemy was likely to fire from and where the terrain offered the best opportunities for observation. Most importantly, he had discovered that the job was exactly what he had hoped it would be. Observe, photograph, report. Nothing more. As he prepared to climb into his aircraft, the squad leader, Fritz Heinzer, approached him. "Ernst, you have a moment?" Fritz asked from about 10 feet away. Ernst turned around and waited for Fritz to reach him. He noticed that Fritz had something in his hand. "You should take this." Fritz reached out his hand to hand him the item. It was a pistol. Ernst held his hand out to ward off the weapon. "I don't need that." "Headquarters thinks the French are carrying pistols," Fritz replied. "And?" Ernst asked. Fritz blinked in disbelief. "They think we should carry them too. Now just take it." Ernst reluctantly took the pistol, held it in his left hand, and looked it over. "If we see any enemy aircraft, we will pursue them and use these pistols to try and take them down." Ernst was taken aback. "I'm not exactly trained for that, sir." Fritz was dismissive. "You point and pull the trigger. It's quite simple." And with that, Fritz turned and walked towards his own aircraft. Once in the cockpit, he wedged the pistol between the seat and the side of the aircraft and left it there for the duration of the mission. Looking up again from his notes, Kruger commented, "So he handed you a pistol and you tucked it into the seat?" "Yes, sir." "How many missions did you fly with the pistol?" Kruger asked. "I think about 35, Ernst answered. "And did you see enemy aircraft at all during that time? During any of those missions?" "Of course I did." "Did you pursue any of them, as your squad leader had requested?" "I did not, sir." "And why is that?" Kruger asked. "Because I had pictures to take of enemy positions, and I felt that took precedent," Ernest answered. "Each time?" "Yes, sir, each time." Kruger wrote again on his pad and said, "Okay, let's continue." The morning began differently than others had. Instead of meeting on the airfield, Ernst and the other pilots found themselves gathered inside one of the larger wooden buildings near headquarters. Nearly 20 men filled the room, all standing, for there were no chairs. Ernest looked around the room. He noticed maps on the wall with ink marks drawn on them in zigzagging lines. Was that what they did with our information? He asked himself. His eyes continued to scan the room when, in the corner, he saw a stool. Not just any stool, a stool with a machine gun attached to it, with large bolts. Ernst found himself staring at the weapon. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. The machine gun sat menacingly, angled up toward the ceiling as if it was waiting for a target. A long belt of brass cartridges fed into the side of it, each round linked to the next in an endless chain. Many of the men spoke in excited, hushed tones. Several glanced towards the machine gun while speculating about its purpose. That is, until Major Hans Schneider walked in. Major Hans Schneider was a tall, heavy man with dark hair, green eyes, and a thick mustache that extended past the corners of his lips. He carried an air of command with him as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "Men," he began, "we are winning this war." He took a moment as the pilots, including Ernst, clapped. Then he held his hand up for silence. "We are winning this war because of the intelligence you bring us every single day. Every day you report enemy movements, you estimate how many there are, and you take pictures, or even draw what you see. Make no mistake, gentlemen, the tasks you perform up there in the sky above the battlefield does not go unnoticed." The major stood for a moment at the front of the room, scanning the faces of the pilots. Then he spoke again. "We at headquarters, however, see that you have been vastly underutilized." He took another moment to let his words sink in, and Ernst could see the confusion on the faces of the pilots in the room with him. He continued, "For months, you pilots have flown above enemy positions with little ability to exploit the opportunities they present." He paused again. "That changes today." He clasped his hands together excitedly, like a schoolboy who had just been given a new slingshot. "When you reach your aircraft today, you will notice a modification." He looked towards the machine gun. "It's a substantial addition, and we are here today to discuss how to use it." The major walked to the machine gun and ran his hand against the metal like he was petting an animal. "When an artillery battery is seen, in the past we would photograph it and try to train our artillery to destroy it. Now you can swoop out of the air and destroy it yourselves." He looked again at the pilots and smiled. "You can now engage supply wagons, trains, enemy troops that are resting in the fields far behind the front lines. You can even swoop down and strafe the trenches themselves." Ernst watched as pilots around the room exchanged glances. Some smiled, and others patted each other on the back. The room was electric with excitement. Ernst rubbed his temples as if he had a headache. Kruger stared at him for several moments before speaking. "So that was the day the machine guns were installed?" "Yes, sir." "And you understood their purpose?" "Yes, sir." Kruger opened the file in front of him and began turning pages. "You were issued ammunition for that weapon?" "Yes, sir." "Every mission?" "Yes, sir." Kruger nodded. "And according to Quartermaster Vogel, you returned with nearly all of it after every flight." Ernst remained silent. Kruger looked up from the file. "Is Quartermaster Vogel mistaken?" "No, sir." "Then perhaps you can explain why he recorded the same thing over and over again." The colonel turned another page and began to run his finger down it line by line. "June 4, 500 rounds issued. June 4, 500 rounds returned. June 6, 500 rounds issued. June 6, 500 rounds returned." The sound of the pages turning seemed louder than the buzzing electric light above them. And on, and on, and on. Kruger closed the file. "You carried a pistol you never used." He pointed at the papers. "You carried a machine gun you never used." His voice remained calm. "Did you fly over enemy troops?" "Yes, sir." "Did you see enemy supply wagons?" "Yes, sir." "So, I'm betting you saw enemy artillery positions, is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "You saw enemy aircraft?" Yes, sir. And still, you never fired. That is correct, sir. For the first time, Kruger leaned forward. Why? Ernst took a slow breath. Because I applied for reconnaissance as an observer and map artist, sir. The colonel's expression hardened. No, Sergeant Falk. He tapped the file with a finger. You applied to assist the Kaiser's army to defend the fatherland, and what better way to defend the fatherland and its interests than destroying the enemy? He leaned back in his chair. Tell me, what use is a map if there are no soldiers left to read it? Ernst remained silent. What use is a photograph if the enemy artillery battery you photograph destroys one of our regiments before our guns can respond? Kruger pointed towards the file. You saw opportunities. His voice sharpened. You were given the means and the orders to act upon them. Ernst felt his face become flushed with anger. I did not enlist to kill. I enlisted to gather intelligence. Intelligence that could be used to save German lives. Nothing more than that. Kruger raised his voice now. And every opportunity you had to save German lives, you did not take. Every trench you could have engaged with, every enemy soldier you did not kill, every weapon you did not attempt to destroy are what takes German lives. Ernst knew he should be silent, but he could not. Maps, positions, information, when used correctly, that is what saves lives, Colonel. Kruger scoffed. Ernst continued. What you did was put us pilots in more danger. We stayed high enough to avoid enemy fire. Then you wanted us swooping down over trenches and artillery positions so we could become larger targets. The colonel opened his mouth to respond, but Ernst passed on. Of the 20 pilots that stood in that room the day Major Schneider introduced those machine guns, do you know how many are left? Kruger said nothing. 3. Kruger put his hands out in a so what gesture. That is part of war. 3 men. 3 good German men. Ernst leaned forward. 17 became casualties. 17. 17 heroes, Kruger added. That is one thing we agree on. They are heroes. Dead heroes. His voice grew quieter. And for what? Because somebody at headquarters decided that a camera and notepad was no longer enough. Kruger was still silent as Ernst stood and walked towards the wall. He leaned up against it. You can train any German to kill. It's much harder to teach one to fly. Kruger let out a hearty guffaw and clapped his hands together. Ha! I like you, Sergeant Falk. Then his face turned to stone. But I did not give you permission to stand. That's because I did not ask for permission. Kruger grunted. I sympathize with losing any good German man, such as those pilots you so eloquently point out. But those men died doing their duty as ordered, something that you neglected, Sergeant Falk. We will have to agree to disagree, Colonel Kruger. I did my job just as I was hired to do. Do you know what your problem is, Sergeant Falk? Ernst said nothing. You still think you were hired. He tapped the eagle on his uniform. You enlisted. What's the difference? Asked Ernst. The difference is that you belong to the army of the Kaiser. You cannot quit. You cannot decide for yourself how this war is fought, and you most certainly cannot refuse orders. So what next? Ernst asked. What's next? Repeated Kruger. I cannot have other pilots thinking that they can disobey orders. I cannot have pilots thinking that they can get away with not engaging the enemy. He paused a moment. An example must be made. It was not the military prison that tortured him. It was not the mediocre food, the discharge on his record, or even the fact that his parents were less than 3 miles away and he could not see them. It was the daily ringing of the church bells. Every time they rang from the inner city of Leipzig, he was reminded that outside of these walls, life went on, and he was missing it. Kruger had made good on his promise to make an example of him. The colonel had convinced a military judge that Ernst's repeated refusal to follow orders could not go unpunished. The sentence had to be severe enough to discourage others from doing the same. Pilots, infantrymen, artillerymen, it did not matter. The army could not function if soldiers chose which orders they wished to obey. It was the German way. It was what the Kaiser would have wanted. In the end, the judge had agreed and gave him what Kruger had asked for: confinement in military prison for the duration of the war. It could have been 2 months, maybe 6, or a year, but so far it had been 3. He did not mind the isolation in his cell exactly. In fact, he found the white painted brick walls to be very inviting and bright. If he looked up above his cot, he could see the stars at night through the small barred window. The prison also maintained a modest library where he was allowed 3 books at a time. He kept those on a shelf that had been bolted into the wall. Every morning, his cell door was unlocked, and he was allowed to roam free around the prison grounds and the yard, which was surrounded by tall fences topped with barbed wire and manned by armed guards. Every evening, he and the other inmates were back in their cells by 7 p.m., where the doors would be locked, leaving them to their thoughts. As the bells rang for the 3rd time today, he knew it was now 5 o'clock in the evening, and he looked towards the sound. "Damn those bells," he said to himself. He was reading a novel by French author Jules Verne when he heard the cell door open. He shifted his attention towards it. Standing in the doorway was a short, stout little man with dark hair, a pointy goatee, and a monocle. He was staring at him. He was dressed in a heavily decorated officer's uniform with the stripes of a colonel. Ernst quickly closed the book and stood at attention. His hand rose to his eyebrow in a salute. He knew that colonels never visited prisoners. "You are no longer a soldier, Mr. Falk. No need to salute me," the man said with a chuckle. Ernst took his hand down but continued to stand at attention, his gaze steadfast towards the wall in front of him. The colonel motioned towards his cot. "Please, sit down." Ernst did what he was told. "My name is Colonel Johann Schneider." He stuck his hand out, and Ernst did likewise to shake it. "Mr. Falk, what do you know about the German war effort as it stands? In October 1918, Schneider asked. "I avoid any and all news of the war, sir. Still, I hear rumblings from the guards and other prisoners. It's not going too well out there," Ernst answered. The colonel nodded his head. "For someone who's not following the war, that is a pretty good assessment." Ernst watched as the man removed his monocle, blew hot air into it, and cleaned it with the lining of his military-issue jacket. He then sat next to Ernst on a cot. "You were convicted 3 years ago with 40 counts of insubordination and an equal amount of defying orders." Kruger, may he rest in peace. Ernst interrupted him. "Kruger is dead?" "Oh, yes. 2 months ago. He was overseeing a supply delivery on the front lines when a shell misfired and, well, he never felt anything. That's a sweet relief for the man." "Sorry to hear that," Ernst added. "I'm sure you are, Falk. I'm sure you are." He paused a moment, then continued. "Anyhow, I'm here to offer you a pardon." "A pardon? Are you sure?" Ernst asked. "Quite sure." Ernst stared at him. "Why?" Schneider smiled. "Because Germany has changed a great deal in 3 years." "And?" "Because desperate nations often reconsider old decisions." "What decisions are those?" Ernst asked. "Well, too many of those to count, but putting very capable pilots in prison could be one of them." "What are you getting at, sir?" "We are short on soldiers, seamen, medical staff, supply men, and of course, by default, pilots. We need you to fly again. Only this time, we do not require observation. We do not require maps. We require fighters." This took Ernst by surprise. They wanted him in the air again. They wanted him to fly. Schneider continued. "If you wish to be free of this place, all you have to do is agree to fly for the Kaiser again." He paused, cleaned his monocle again, and let the words hang in the air before he dropped the hammer. "Only this time, you must actually fire the weapon." The ground rushed towards him as smoke billowed from the side of the plane. He briefly looked out at the mangled wing on the left side of his aircraft. the canvas tearing with the pressure of the wind. Before him, he saw lush green grass, a piece of France untouched by the war. To his right, the ragged hellscape of the German trench lines and no man's land, and in the far distance lay the French and British lines. His shoulder ached. He looked down. Blood. One flight. One battle. That was all it took. One attempt at strafing the enemy lines. His machine gun had rattled as he swooped his aircraft down low enough to see the looks on some of the men's faces. Then he had swooped up again, his plan to gain altitude, turn around, and make another run. As he climbed, however, he was met by a French plane. Or was it American? He did not know. It all happened so fast. He banked hard left in an effort to elude the enemy aircraft. To run. His heart was racing. Sweat leaked into his goggles. He felt the impact of the bullets hit the side of his plane in the wings. And now, as the ground got even closer, he looked to his right again, at the trenches, at the hellscape, at the billowing smoke. I photographed that, he said to himself, and smiled. You've been listening to World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches, where history comes alive through the lives of those who lived it. If this episode moved you, please share it, follow, and leave a rating. Help keep these stories alive. Want to hold these stories in your hand? Explore the books inspired by them, available now on Kindle and in paperback.